The courthouse was large and imposing, a place where people came to seek justice. It had high ceilings, marble floors, and echoing footsteps that made it feel cold and distant. Inside, the atmosphere was tense as people waited for their cases to be heard. At the front of the room sat Judge Harrison, a man with a reputation for being strict and unforgiving. He had been a judge for many years and was known for his tough decisions. People said that he didn't care much for the people who appeared in his court, especially those he thought were beneath him. On this particular day, Maya Johnson stood nervously in the back of the courtroom. She was heavily pregnant, her belly round with the life growing inside her. Maya was a strong woman, but today she felt a little anxious. She wasn't used to being in courtrooms, and the idea of facing a judge like Harrison made her even more nervous. Still, she knew she had to do it. She was there because a former employer had wronged her. They had refused to pay her for the work she had done, and Maya needed to stand up for what was right. As she waited for her turn, Maya couldn't help but feel out of place. Her clothes were simple, a modest dress that didn't draw attention. She wasn't rich or famous, and she didn't have the flashy, expensive appearance that many people in the courtroom seemed to have. Most people probably wouldn't even notice her as she stood in the back. When her name was called, Maya took a deep breath and walked up to the front. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to stand tall. She was here to fight for something important, and she wasn't going to back down now. The judge barely looked up when she stepped forward. He glanced at her, then quickly returned to the paperwork in front of him. His eyes scanned her, and there was a brief moment where Maya could sense his judgment. He didn't see her as someone who deserved respect or attention. She was just another woman, another person to deal with in his busy day. "State your case," Judge Harrison ordered, his voice cold and detached. Maya took a moment to collect herself. "Your Honor, I worked for a company for several months, and after I completed my job, they refused to pay me the wages I earned. I've tried to reach out to them, but they've ignored my requests. I'm here because I need justice." Her voice was steady, but inside, she felt her nerves fluttering. Judge Harrison didn't respond right away. He glanced at the papers in front of him, barely acknowledging what Maya had said. He seemed uninterested in her struggle. "You should have known better," he muttered under his breath. "You shouldn't have worked for them in the first place." Maya's heart sank. It wasn't what she had expected. She thought the judge would at least listen to her. Instead, he was already dismissing her, judging her without giving her a chance. His words felt like a punch in the stomach. He looked up at her again, his eyes cold. "You're pregnant, I see. Are you sure you should be wasting your time here?" His tone was sharp, and Maya could feel the weight of his disapproval. It felt like he was making her situation worse with every word. But Maya was determined. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to let this judge make her feel small. She held her head high, refusing to let him intimidate her. But she knew in her gut that things were about to get worse. Little did she know, Judge Harrison didn't just have a bias against people like her. He had no idea who she really was. Maya stood in front of Judge Harrison, trying to steady her breath. Her heart raced as she looked around the courtroom. The walls, with their tall windows and shiny floors, felt cold and distant. The judge's stern face only made the room feel more intimidating. Maya wasn't used to places like this. She was a private person, someone who preferred to keep to herself. She didn't like the spotlight, and the courtroom was definitely the last place she ever thought she would find herself. But here she was, standing up for what she believed was right. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his papers as Maya spoke. She could feel the weight of his disinterest. He didn't seem to care about her story or the hard work she had put into her job. Instead, he seemed focused only on her appearance, her simple dress, her pregnant belly, and maybe even the nervousness in her voice. To him, Maya was just another case, another person in his busy day. "I need the money I earned," Maya continued, her voice soft but firm. "It's not just for me. It's for my child. I've worked hard, and I shouldn't be treated like this." Judge Harrison looked up at her, his expression blank. He sighed, as if he had already heard enough. "You should have thought about that before you worked for people like that," he said, barely giving her a chance to explain. Maya bit her lip to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She had tried everything to get the money she was owed. She had sent emails, made phone calls, and even visited the company's office. But every time she reached out, they ignored her. She never imagined it would come to this, to standing in front of a judge who didn't seem to care at all. As she tried to explain, Judge Harrison barely listened. He shuffled through papers on his desk, as if Maya were just another case to move through quickly. His gaze moved past her, as if she were invisible. It was as if he didn't see her for who she really was, a woman trying to make a living, a mother who wanted to provide for her child. To him, she was just someone to get rid of. His dismissive attitude made Maya's stomach twist. But Maya was determined not to back down. She wasn't going to let him brush her off. "I understand your time is valuable, Your Honor," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. "But this isn't just about the money. It's about standing up for what's right." Judge Harrison's eyes flickered for a second, but his face remained stern. He wasn't interested in hearing more. His gaze moved over her once again, and she could almost feel the judgment in the air. "You shouldn't even be here," he muttered, as if her presence was an inconvenience. Maya's heart sank. She had hoped for a fair hearing, a chance to explain her side, but it felt like Judge Harrison had already made up his mind. She was just another person he didn't have time for, just another case he wanted to move through quickly. Yet even as the judge dismissed her, Maya's inner strength refused to fade. She wasn't going to let anyone treat her like she didn't matter. Little did Judge Harrison know, the woman standing before him was far more than just a pregnant lady in a courtroom. Maya had a secret, one that would change everything. Maya's heart dropped as Judge Harrison continued to look through his papers without any real interest in what she was saying. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would listen and understand her situation. But instead, his words stung, and his actions felt dismissive. It was clear to her now that this wasn't going to be a fair hearing. She had tried to explain herself, but the judge didn't even seem to care. "Your claim is weak," Judge Harrison muttered, still not looking up. "You're just wasting my time." Maya stood there, stunned. She had expected some resistance, but this was different. It wasn't just the refusal to listen. It was the way he belittled her. His words felt like a slap in the face. She had worked so hard, doing her best to support herself and the baby growing inside her. All she wanted was what she was owed, the money she had worked for. But instead of receiving any understanding or compassion, she was met with judgment and coldness. The judge continued without giving her a chance to respond. "I'm not sure why you're even bothering with this," he said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You should be home resting, not here fighting over a paycheck. Maybe if you didn't make poor choices, you wouldn't be in this mess." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to show weakness in front of him. She knew this was not about her or her case anymore. This was about him, his pride, his power, and his refusal to listen. Maya took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wasn't going to let him see how much his words hurt. This wasn't about him. This was about her, and the fight she had to keep fighting for the sake of her baby. The judge finally looked up at her, his expression still indifferent. "Case dismissed," he said coldly, not even bothering to explain his decision. He slammed his gavel down, and Maya's heart sank. She hadn't won. She hadn't even been heard. As she turned to leave, Maya could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her. The whispers, the stares, everyone seemed to be watching her as she walked out. It was as if she were invisible to them, just a woman who didn't matter. It stung, but Maya refused to let it break her. She walked down the hallway, her hands trembling. The weight of the judge's ruling pressed on her chest, but she couldn't stop now. She had already come this far, and she wasn't going to give up just because a judge didn't think she deserved to be heard. She wasn't like everyone else. She was different. What Judge Harrison didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Maya was more than just a pregnant woman in a courtroom. She was someone who had built a life from nothing, someone who had worked hard to get where she was. And despite the harsh treatment she had just received, Maya knew she wasn't done yet. This wasn't the end of her fight. It was only the beginning. Little did Judge Harrison know, his cruel behavior had just set in motion something much bigger than he could ever imagine. Maya's story was far from over. As Maya left the courtroom, her mind was spinning. The sting of the judge's words echoed in her head, each one a painful reminder of how she had been dismissed, ignored, and belittled. She had hoped for justice, or at least a fair chance to explain herself, but all she had received was a harsh rejection. She had walked in with the hope that things would be different, but now it felt as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders. Outside the courtroom, the air felt heavy, as if the walls of the building were closing in on her. She had hoped for a peaceful exit, to leave and figure out her next steps in private. But the hallway outside the courtroom was crowded with people, each of them whispering to one another, and some of them casting glances her way. Maya kept her head down, trying not to draw attention to herself. She didn't want anyone to see her weakness, but she felt humiliated, her pride bruised. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Judge Harrison, who had followed her out into the hallway. His face was a mask of indifference, but his eyes were filled with something else, something sharp and cold. Maya's stomach twisted. What was he doing here? He had already made his decision, hadn't he? Without warning, the judge stepped forward, blocking her path. His presence was intimidating. Maya had no choice but to stop, even though every part of her wanted to keep walking. "I told you to leave," Judge Harrison said, his voice low and commanding. Maya could feel the anger behind his words, but she was too stunned to respond. She hadn't expected him to follow her out of the courtroom, let alone say anything more. "I'm not done here," he continued, his tone growing more harsh. "You shouldn't have come. People like you have no place in my courtroom." Before Maya could fully process his words, Judge Harrison made a sharp motion with his hand. As he did, he pushed her gently, yet firmly, out of his way. It wasn't a simple gesture. It was deliberate and aggressive. He didn't just want her out of his path. He wanted to show his power, to remind her of his authority. Maya stumbled back, the force of his push catching her off guard. Her balance faltered, and for a moment, she feared she might fall. She felt a rush of panic, but she quickly steadied herself, refusing to let him see her weakness. The people in the hallway watched, some with expressions of disbelief, others with their heads down, avoiding the uncomfortable scene unfolding before them. Maya's face burned with embarrassment, but she refused to let him see how much it had shaken her. She stood her ground, wiping her hands on her dress, trying to hide the tremor in her fingers. "Get out of my way," Judge Harrison snapped, his voice louder now. Maya couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a moment of cruelty. Yet, deep down, Maya felt a fire igniting inside her. This wasn't the end. No matter how small and powerless she might have felt in that moment, she knew she had a strength that no one could take away from her. With every ounce of dignity she could muster, Maya walked past the judge, her head held high. She wasn't just walking away from the courthouse. She was walking away from his cruelty, and she would never look back. Little did Judge Harrison know, his cruel actions had just lit a spark. Maya's journey was far from over, and soon he would regret crossing her path. Maya walked out of the courthouse, feeling a mixture of anger and confusion. The judge's behavior had taken her completely by surprise. She had expected a fair trial, a chance to present her case, but instead, she had been humiliated. His actions had made her feel small and invisible. As she stepped out into the bright sunlight, Maya couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced the same cold treatment in his courtroom. How many had walked away feeling powerless, just like she had. But even as the hurt from the day's events threatened to overwhelm her, Maya refused to let it define her. She knew she couldn't let this setback stop her. She had worked too hard for too long to let one judge take away her sense of self-worth. What Judge Harrison didn't know, though, was that Maya was far more than just a woman in a courtroom. She wasn't the average person he was used to seeing. In fact, Maya had a secret, one that few people knew about. Maya wasn't just a pregnant woman trying to get a paycheck. She was an incredibly successful entrepreneur. Over the years, she had built a thriving business from the ground up. She wasn't a celebrity or someone who flaunted her wealth. She preferred to keep a low profile, focusing instead on her work and helping others in her community. Maya had intentionally stayed out of the public eye, avoiding attention and choosing instead to lead by example. Her company, a startup that had grown into a well-respected name in the industry, had made her one of the wealthiest women in the country. She had used her success to give back to causes she cared about, especially those that supported underprivileged families and helped young women get a start in business. But even though Maya had the means to live a life of luxury, she had chosen a more humble path. She didn't want to be seen as just another rich person. She wanted to be seen for her work, her values, and her commitment to making the world a better place. Today, as she walked away from the courthouse, Maya was thinking about how best to respond to the injustice she had faced. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about something bigger. She had to find a way to make sure this never happened again. No one, no matter their background, should be treated the way she had been. The media hadn't yet caught wind of what had happened in the courtroom, but Maya knew it wouldn't be long before the story began to spread. After all, a judge treating someone with such disrespect was bound to attract attention. What Maya didn't expect was how quickly the story would snowball. A local journalist who had been passing through the courthouse overheard a snippet of conversation between Maya and her lawyer. The reporter was intrigued, and before long, Maya's name started to circulate in the media. The story of the pregnant woman who had been mistreated by a powerful judge was one that captured people's attention. The media quickly began digging into Maya's background, and soon they would uncover the truth about who she really was. As the pieces of the puzzle started to come together, Maya knew that this could be the moment that changed everything. What Judge Harrison hadn't realized was that Maya wasn't someone he could simply dismiss. Her story was just beginning, and soon, the world would see her for who she truly was. The story of what happened in the courtroom spread quickly. At first, it was just a small mention in a local news outlet, but it didn't take long for it to gain traction. People were shocked by the way Judge Harrison had treated Maya. The media coverage started to grow, and soon the story was all over the news. Maya, however, was still trying to process everything that had happened. She hadn't expected this kind of attention. All she wanted was to get what she was owed and move on with her life. But now, her story was being shared with the world. The pressure of it all was overwhelming at times. Maya found herself at the center of a storm she had never intended to be a part of. Reporters began showing up at her office, asking questions, trying to get a glimpse of the woman who had stood up to a powerful judge. People were fascinated by her, and they wanted to know everything about her life. But Maya didn't want to be famous. She didn't want to be treated like a celebrity. She just wanted the judge to be held accountable for his actions. One afternoon, as Maya was sitting in her office, a phone call came through. It was from a reporter from a well-known news network. He introduced himself and said he wanted to interview her. Maya hesitated for a moment before agreeing. She knew that she couldn't stay silent any longer. Her story was already out there, and if she didn't speak up, others might tell it for her. This was her chance to take control of the narrative. The reporter, a young man named Jason, was polite and respectful as he asked Maya about what had happened. She took a deep breath and began to explain the events of that day in the courtroom, describing how she had been dismissed and treated unfairly by Judge Harrison. She spoke about her determination to get the money she was owed, but also about how his actions had made her feel. She was careful not to let her emotions overwhelm her, but it wasn't easy. It hurt to relive those moments, but Maya knew it was necessary. Jason listened intently, asking thoughtful questions along the way. After the interview, He promised to write a fair and honest story, one that would shed light on the judge's actions. Maya felt a sense of relief. For the first time since the incident, she felt like her voice had been heard. The following day, the interview was published, and it quickly went viral. People all over the country were talking about Maya's story. Many were angry at the way she had been treated, while others admired her courage for speaking out. The response was overwhelming. Maya's phone was flooded with messages from people offering support, encouragement, and praise. She had become a symbol of resilience for many, someone who stood up against injustice. But there was also a sense of fear. She knew that Judge Harrison wouldn't take this quietly. He would be angry, and he would try to protect his reputation. Maya had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Things were changing, and she was no longer just the pregnant woman in a courtroom. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the world was beginning to see it. The turning point had come. What started as a small incident in a cold courtroom had turned into something much bigger. Maya knew that her fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Maya's story continued to make waves in the media. The more people heard about what had happened in the courtroom, the more furious they became. How could a judge, someone who was supposed to serve justice, act in such an unfair and cruel way? The public outrage was growing by the day. What Maya had experienced wasn't just a minor issue. It was a reminder of how some people in power abused their positions, and the people who felt the sting of their actions had nowhere to turn. Soon, the story spread beyond just local news. National media outlets picked it up, and soon, everyone was talking about Maya. Social media was flooded with messages of support for her, with hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #PowerOfThePeople trending everywhere. People from all walks of life, from business leaders to everyday citizens, shared their thoughts on what had happened. Many said it was a shame that someone like Judge Harrison could act with such cruelty, while others praised Maya for standing up for herself and her rights. Maya could hardly believe how quickly everything was changing. She had never asked for this kind of attention. She was just a woman trying to get her paycheck and defend her dignity. But now, her story had become a symbol of hope for many. She had given people the courage to stand up for themselves in the face of injustice. Even though Maya was grateful for the support, she also felt the pressure building. This was no longer just about one unfair decision. It was about something much bigger. The courthouse where Judge Harrison worked became the center of a storm. People began calling for an investigation into the judge's behavior. News reporters gathered outside the courthouse every day, trying to get a comment from anyone who knew him. The judicial system was under the spotlight, and they couldn't ignore what had happened. Whispers of reform began circulating. People were demanding that the justice system be held accountable. But there was still a sense of fear surrounding Maya. She had become a target of sorts, with some people questioning her intentions. Was she really seeking justice, or was she just trying to ruin the career of an influential man? But Maya wasn't worried about what people thought of her. She had a stronger purpose now, to make sure no one would face what she had faced, and to see that Judge Harrison was held accountable for his actions. Behind closed doors, the pressure was mounting on Judge Harrison. Colleagues in the legal world started to question his conduct. How could someone in such a position of power behave this way? Many were already looking into his past rulings, searching for any signs of similar behavior. Soon, an official investigation was launched to examine his actions both inside and outside the courtroom. While all of this unfolded, Maya kept her focus. She didn't have time to deal with the distractions or the noise. She had a mission now, to make sure this injustice didn't just fade away into the background. She wasn't going to let people forget what had happened. Judge Harrison had crossed a line, and it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. In the midst of everything, Maya felt a quiet strength building inside her. She knew this wasn't just about one court case anymore. It was about making a change for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or belittled. And as the fallout from the judge's actions continued to grow, Maya's role in this fight was far from over. She had become more than just a victim of injustice. She was now a symbol of courage and the fight for fairness. As the investigation into Judge Harrison's actions unfolded, the world began to turn its attention to him. The media coverage didn't let up, and soon, every news outlet was covering the story. People from all over the country were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Maya had become the face of a movement, a symbol of strength and resilience in the face of injustice. It was clear now that her fight was about more than just her own case. It was about holding people in power accountable for their actions. For weeks, Maya continued to speak out about her experience. She used her newfound platform to bring attention to the unfair treatment she had received and to demand change in the judicial system. Maya knew that this wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had ever been mistreated or ignored, whether by a judge, a boss, or anyone in a position of power. She wanted to make sure that no one else would ever feel as small and powerless as she had that day in the courtroom. The pressure on Judge Harrison was building. His colleagues and the public were demanding answers. How could a judge who was supposed to uphold the law and deliver justice behave so cruelly? Maya's voice grew louder and louder, and with every interview, every speech, the public's anger toward the judge grew stronger. It wasn't long before an official disciplinary hearing was scheduled to review his actions. The investigation had finally begun. Maya knew that this was just the beginning. It wasn't enough for her to simply speak out. She wanted real change. She worked with legal experts, advocacy groups, and other community leaders to push for reforms that would ensure that judges like Harrison would not be able to abuse their power without consequence. Maya wasn't interested in personal revenge. What she wanted was justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. On the day of the disciplinary hearing, the tension was palpable. Maya sat quietly in the back of the room as the proceedings began. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that this was an important moment. The judge's fate was now in the hands of the legal system, and she hoped that they would do the right thing. As the hearing unfolded, the evidence against Judge Harrison became clear. Testimonies were given, and it became obvious that his actions in the courtroom that day were not isolated incidents. There were other cases in which his behavior had been questionable, and soon, the truth was undeniable. His cruelty toward Maya had been just one part of a larger pattern of unfairness that had affected many others. The hearing was intense, and the pressure on the judge mounted. Finally, after hours of testimony and deliberation, the decision was made. Judge Harrison was removed from his position, his career in ruins. It was a victory, not just for Maya, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the system. As she left the hearing, Maya felt a sense of peace. The fight had been long and difficult, but she had won. Her determination had paid off, and the world had seen the truth. This wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for justice, for fairness, and for everyone who had ever been overlooked or mistreated. Maya had fought for what was right, and she had succeeded. But she knew this wasn't the end of her journey. There was still work to be done. And Maya, stronger than ever, was ready to continue the fight for a better world. The courtroom had been silent for a moment. The final decision had been made. Judge Harrison was officially removed from his position, his career permanently tarnished. The room was filled with murmurs, a mix of relief and satisfaction. For Maya, it felt like a heavy weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. It wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about something deeper, a victory for fairness, for standing up for what's right, and for the countless others who had been wronged but didn't have the courage to speak out. Maya stood up, her eyes shining with quiet pride. She had never wanted to seek revenge, nor had she hoped for this moment of public humiliation for the judge. What she had wanted all along was justice. Justice for herself, yes, but also for everyone who had ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or treated unfairly because of who they were. She had fought this battle not just as a woman, not just as a pregnant mother, but as someone who believed deeply in the idea that everyone should be treated with dignity and respect. As she walked out of the hearing, she was greeted with the applause and cheers of those who had supported her from the beginning. The crowd was a mix of journalists, legal advocates, and ordinary citizens who had followed her journey. They had watched her rise above the cruel treatment she had faced, and now they were celebrating her strength. Maya smiled, but her thoughts were focused on the future. The truth was, this was just the beginning. Maya had become a symbol of resilience, but she wasn't content to rest on that alone. She had a platform now, and she was determined to use it to make a real difference. Maya knew that the system wasn't perfect, and while one judge had been held accountable, there was much more work to be done. She had the resources, the voice, and the determination to push for meaningful change in the justice system. Maya began working with organizations that focused on legal reform, especially for people from underserved communities. She became an advocate for fair treatment, fighting against discrimination and bias in the courtroom. Her business background helped her understand how important it was to take action, not just talk about it. She worked tirelessly to create programs that would help those who had no voice, just as she had once been silent and invisible. Months passed, and Maya's work began to gain more attention. She was invited to speak at conferences, at schools, and in front of groups who needed to hear her message. Her life had changed in ways she never imagined, but she was ready for it. She had found a new purpose, one that was bigger than herself, bigger than the case she had fought for. The story of Judge Harrison's fall from grace remained a part of the conversation, but for Maya, it wasn't about him anymore. It was about the future she was helping to shape, a future where no one would ever feel the way she had felt in that courtroom, small, insignificant, and ignored. Maya's journey had been difficult, but she had emerged stronger and more determined than ever. And now, with justice on her side, she was ready to continue fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. The fight for fairness and equality would continue, and Maya would lead the charge, knowing that the power of one voice could change everything.